Maya stood in front of the towering apartment building, its weathered facade looming against the twilight sky. She had just signed the lease for apartment 3B, a cheap find in a city where rent was skyrocketing. The building, built in the 1920s, had a strange stillness about it, like it held its breath. As she unlocked the door, the hinges creaked, and the air inside felt colder than outside. She shrugged it off. It was an old building after all. That night, as Maya unpacked, she heard faint footsteps above her. She paused, listening. The footsteps were too heavy to be just a neighbor, but they stopped as suddenly as they started. Checking the time, she reasoned it must be someone moving furniture late at night. She turned back to her unpacking, unaware of the eyes watching her from the shadows of the hallway. The next morning, Maya bumped into Mrs. Hargrove, an elderly woman who lived in 4A, directly above her. Mrs. Hargrove seemed frail but friendly, though her eyes carried an unsettling depth. Maya asked if she had heard the noises from the night before, but Mrs. Hargrove just smiled faintly and said, "This place always makes strange sounds at night. You'll get used to it." The rest of the day passed quietly until that night when the sounds came back. Footsteps again, but this time they were accompanied by something else, a soft, almost inaudible whispering. Maya pressed her ear against the wall, trying to catch the words. Suddenly, a loud knock came from above, as if someone was pounding on the floor. She shot up in bed, heart racing, and ran upstairs to confront Mrs. Hargrove. But when she knocked, no one answered. After several attempts, she turned to leave, only to notice the apartment door slightly ajar. Against her better judgment, she pushed it open. The apartment was cold, much colder than her own, and everything inside was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if no one had lived there for years. Maya's breath hitched. Mrs. Hargrove had just spoken to her that morning, yet it looked like no one had touched anything in weeks. Faint whispers echoed from the hallway. Shaken, Maya hurried back downstairs, but sleep was impossible. Every sound seemed amplified, the creaking of pipes, the groaning of the building, and that whispering always at the edge of her hearing. She resolved to call the landlord in the morning. When she did, the landlord's voice on the other end sounded concerned but oddly vague. "Mrs. Hargrove? Are you sure? That apartment's been empty for months." Maya's head spun. She had spoken to Mrs. Hargrove, hadn't she? Desperate for answers, she started asking other tenants about 4A, but no one knew anything concrete. Some said they'd heard things at night but dismissed it as the building settling. Others gave her nervous glances and changed the subject. Determined, Maya began researching the building's history. She discovered it had once been a grand hotel in the 1920s, but was converted into apartments after a fire gutted the upper floors. There were rumors of people who had died in the blaze, trapped in their rooms. The more she dug, the more she found stories of strange disappearances and tenants moving out without notice. Late that night, Maya heard the footsteps again, this time directly in her living room. She turned, heart hammering, to see a shadow standing in the doorway. "Mrs. Hargrove, why are you in my apartment?" Maya's voice shook as she backed away. The shadow didn't answer. It just stood there, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, watching her. Panic set in as Maya ran for the door, but it slammed shut on its own. The walls began to close in, the whispering growing louder, suffocating. "You shouldn't have stayed," Mrs. Hargrove's voice rasped, though her lips didn't move. "We're all still here waiting." Maya fumbled with her phone, trying to dial for help, but her fingers wouldn't stop trembling. The whispering swelled until it became a deafening roar, and the lights flickered violently. The last thing she saw before the room went completely black was Mrs. Hargrove's face, inches from hers, twisted into a grotesque smile. The next morning, the landlord arrived, responding to complaints of strange noises from other tenants. He knocked on 3B, but there was no answer. When he unlocked the door, the apartment was empty, except for a thin layer of dust covering everything, as if no one had lived there for years. As the landlord turned to leave, he heard faint footsteps from above. With a nervous glance toward the ceiling, he shut the door, pretending he didn't hear the soft whisper that followed him down the hall. If you like this story, please subscribe, like and share, and tell us what you thought of our story.